Today we're going to be talking about human spatial behavior, how people use space in their everyday interactions. And before I get into today's material, I just want to pick up on a few things from last week on environmental assessment. Yeah, there used to be at this campus back in the 80s a campus environmental assessment team. We had this team of students going around and doing assessments on the campus, the library, Aldrich Park. A lot of times students were complaining about Aldrich Park being too wet because of the overwatering. And we sponsored a creative change contest where students were invited to send in proposals of things that could be done to improve the campus. And there were a lot of really interesting proposals that came in. One of them was to paint some of the classrooms. And this is social science lab building painted red with some interesting posters put in there to make that room a little bit more interesting for the students. Another proposal that was funded was to tag some of the trees and historical spots in Aldrich Park. So if you go into Aldrich Park and walk around, you'll see a number of different tags, metal tags that have been affixed to show sort of points of interest in the park. Now, last time I mentioned that there were a lot of different simulation approaches, from scale models, static, to scale models, dynamic, to full-scale dynamic. And this is a full-scale dynamic lab. It used to be in social ecology 1 building. And these are some folks that helped run that lab. Ted Scharf there is now a senior scientist at the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health in Cincinnati. So we had a whole program of work environment research going on. And we did studies comparing people's reactions to adjustable and non-adjustable computer furniture. This was in the days before ergonomic furniture was really popularized. We also varied different ambient conditions, like whether people were surrounded by natural elements. In the bottom photo, that was a natural environment condition, or the more urban condition where the pictures, the posters were of urbanscapes rather than landscapes, and we looked at people's task performance, their emotions while they were in those situations, working in this full-scale dynamic simulation laboratory. So that's the view from sort of the natural environment condition. And you can see how old those monitors are. Those are Alpha Micro computers, early vintage, so we've come away since then. But in addition to these simulation strategies, I want to mention a couple of examples of diagnostic walkthroughs that can be done on existing environments. This is part of the post-occupancy evaluation approach. And I'll give you a couple of case studies. This is one that I was involved with an environmental impact firm called LSA Associates. They write reports on proposed developments to see if they will qualify for the CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. And they were moving from a building in Newport Center, this building here on the 5th floor, to a building over in Jamboree Center on MacArthur and Maine. So they wanted to know, what do you see when you walk through this environment that's working well, not so well? What can we do to improve our future digs when we move into the new space? So we walked through and we saw a lot of things. This is the reception office or area for their old space in Fashion Island. And you can see it's pretty crowded there. You've got this couch for visitors. This is the front door. This is the receptionist. And over to the receptionist's left is the data programmer who's working there kind of in the corner behind that screen. Very minimal privacy opportunities there and a lot of distraction. We also noticed some pretty poor ergonomics in the workstations, the non-adjustable monitors and things like that. They had fairly nice space. They had views of Newport Bay and Fashion Island out their windows, but their interior working conditions were not very optimal. They had people working close together without any kind of separation in that case. This was their conference room before they moved to the new space. So as we looked at what was going on, we developed a kind of environmental audit, and we put together these posters that had examples of things that could be changed and improved in their future space. And we met with the members of that company to get them involved, to get them participating in some of those decisions. And the management approved that. They were all for that. And some of you, for extra credit, might want to do that type of a poster board where you go into an environment and you kind of assess what's working well or what isn't from the perspective of things you're learning in this course about environmental assessment or wayfinding or personal space and the like. So you present the findings, you get the people in that organization involved in sort of deciding what's coming next. All right, so one of the things we did to get the workers involved in participating is we had them consider color schemes for the new offices. And we showed them this designer's guide to color and had them look at these various shades. And then we gave them a questionnaire which said, you know, from among those colors that they viewed, list your top 3 choices of colors that you would like to see in your new office. And based on that information, the designer who was working with us, Roger Lee from the Bay Area, put together alternative color schemes. And these were shown to the workers. This was kind of in the pastel shades of blues and mauves. This was another version of that color scheme, an alternate color scheme. So the workers kind of voted on those and they could choose. And there's a question in the study guide about how does environmental assessment, or how can environmental assessment be used to increase people's participation in the design of their environments. And this is an example where you ask them about things they don't like about the office or colors they prefer in the next space, and you get them involved, even voting for those different combinations. And I mentioned last week that the designer also did these activity drawings in terms of who needed to work with whom in the office, and then came up with a plan for the new space that kind of separated the 2 divisions of the company on those 2 sides, with a central conference room, library areas back here, the reception space. So all of that was pre-designed programming, and it was based on the post-occupancy evaluation of their existing space. And remember, they're moving to a new space, so they want to try to optimize that. The designer also came up with this scheme that they could have these doors that were on hinges. So rather than having traditional doors, they could slide these on a gantry for more or less privacy. And when they wanted to work as a team, they could get together in the outer space like that. So it was kind of a neat design feature, and they actually custom built these for the new space. So let's take a look at some of the changes that they made in the new space. This is MacArthur, this is Jamboree Center on MacArthur in Maine. And they were up in, I think, the 5th floor of this building. And one of the things you see when you walk into their reception space now is they've really optimized kind of the separation between the staff and the public coming into that environment. They're also using environmental semiotics or communication symbolism to showcase their products here. And they've got a nice clean logo for their company. So they've made some changes to the reception area based on kind of what we were seeing in the old space. This is their conference room, which I've showed you before. And you can see, compared to the old conference room, now they've got a lot more symbolism of the workers there, their achievements, the things that they have collaborated on together. So when the workers go in there, they get a sense of their shared group identity. And that's really important in work organizations. So here we're using environmental assessments, both pre-design evaluation and post-occupancy evaluation, to try to enhance a work organization and their basic work functions in that company. And this is a picture of what those swinging doors look like on the hinges that they had custom designed based on the evaluation. And these are some of the employees in their meal area. They previously had a very dingy area to have lunch, and they put some investment into bringing some plants and natural environment in here, and a much cheerier kind of inviting space. And again, using the environment to communicate what they do in that company. So when they have visitors walking through, they see that and they can kind of relate to what the company's functions are. Now, I want to show you one other example of a diagnostic walkthrough. This is based on more of a manufacturing environment. And for many years, we had a UCI Health Promotion Center funded by several grants from the California Wellness Foundation. And we were helping companies sort of get into compliance with the Worksite Injury and Illness Prevention Law in California. And that was a pretty stiff law, because if people didn't comply, if corporate managers didn't comply with the regulations, they could be fined $7,000 a day, which is a lot of money. Now, trying to keep tabs on all the small businesses in California is very, very difficult, so not that many people actually were fined, but nonetheless, a lot of companies wanted to get into better compliance. So we began this kind of effort called Reach Out for Safety, which trained up employees and managers on how to be in compliance with the new California state law for worksite wellness. And this is that legislation, which I showed you last time, copy of that Senate Bill 198. And this is Meredith Wells. She's another former student, PhD student in social ecology, who got her degree here, then went on and became an assistant professor at the University of Kentucky. But she was heading up this worksite audit or diagnostic walkthrough team. And so what these walkthroughs involve is you go through and you look for safety issues that might be out of compliance with the regulations. And rather than sort of turning in these companies and saying, hey, these are people that could be fined, what we were trying to do is counsel them and give them sort of more expert advice on things they could do to get in compliance so they wouldn't be fined. So it was really something in their interest, and they appreciated that, and that's why they participated in the study. So when you do a walkthrough for safety issues, you're looking for things like whether the individuals are wearing safety equipment like those goggles and the earplugs. So we're doing some behavior mapping on how the employees are actually using the space. Are they using the protective equipment that's mandated? As well, the law says that copies of the legislation should be mounted clearly and visibly in the workspace so that workers know what their rights are, what's expected of the company in terms of health and safety. So here you've got a company that's got that, the legal stuff well displayed. This is another example of a company that's doing that in terms of emergency procedures and hazards management. But then in terms of using physical traces in this assessment, we found some companies like this. So they've got their signage up, but it's so totally blocked and the print is so small that no workers could ever reasonably read that stuff, right? They're just blocked. So this is a kind of physical trace that, you know, calls out, we're not in compliance. They're mandated to have fire extinguishers. Well, here we have a missing physical trace. Somebody's got their handbag hanging up where the fire extinguisher should have been. And so this is what Zeisel means by a missing trace. And so this is how you can use some of these physical cues, and you may do this in some of your extra credit projects, looking for these things in a residential situation or a workplace in terms of how that environment's working or not working. Other things we did is measure noise levels. So this is a handheld dosimeter. It measures the decibels of noise in a particular environment. This is actually a community noise analyzer, which goes for several 24-hour periods to analyze the traffic noise levels in a neighborhood. So this is another way that objective recordings of light, sound, temperature can be used to assess whether an environment is congruent with the needs of its users or not. And here again is an example of that kind of poster board based on the environmental audit. And you can see things here. This is actually from the LSA and the UCI Financial Services. So you can see that case here where someone's using a prop to reduce glare on the computer screen. The work conference room that has no symbolism at all, telling people, you know, what's going on, what their identity is in that space. So there are a lot of things you can pull out based on various principles we've been talking about to identify areas that need to be fixed in that environment. So you use those kind of summaries to let people know, you know, to flag issues that they may want to consider for future improvement. Now, we also said that physical traces say something about the social climate, not just the physical quality of the environment, but the social climate. So here you've got bars on a window, and you can say, well, that's just a physical part of the environment. But what it symbolizes is that there's a concern about crime in that neighborhood or, you know, in that residence. So it creates a kind of climate of fear. And that's one of the problems with gated communities, that people see those gates and they feel like they must be needed, otherwise, you know, people would be victimized. So there's a kind of separation that goes on with that kind of gating. Other cues, such as this vision and value statement that we've talked about before, that also says something about the social climate or the commitment of that company to certain social goals. And as we said, it's kind of gutsy to put that up on the wall because there are a lot of lofty values listed there, and the employees go by that every day when they go into the elevator. So if it's not working so well, that becomes a kind of contradiction, right? So that's another example of a cue that says something about the social climate of that environment. And here you've got a neighborhood in Baltimore where the residents have invested And the city has invested in a kind of beautification program where plants have been brought in. One of the problems of low-income inner-city environments is that people have very little access to nature. And we've already seen how nature makes a difference in people's recovery from surgery in a hospital. But we'll also see later in the course how contact with nature and restorative environments reduces stress and has a lot of positive effects on people. So what is going on in this particular neighborhood in Baltimore is bringing in the natural environment and creating a different kind of social climate on that street because of the presence of those plants and other sort of touches that improve the visual quality of the environment. So do any of you have any questions on any of the examples I covered there? We talked about full-scale dynamic simulation in our earlier laboratory in Social Ecology 1. We talked about a couple of examples of diagnostic walkthroughs where you can use physical traces, behavioral mapping to evaluate the quality of an environment and to improve it for the future. And that's what we're doing environmental assessment for typically, to improve an existing environment or improve a future one. And then we talked about some of these physical traces of social climate. So any comments or questions at all about that? Yeah, say your name. Sakia.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on full scale?
On which?
On full scale.
I'm sorry.
Full scale.
Oh, full scale. Sakia was asking, what do I mean by full scale simulation? A scale model is like a miniature little model that you show people. Or it could be a model of Marin County like we showed at the Berkeley lab or at the University of Lund, where you drive a camera through it and you get these eye-level views to approximate what pedestrians would see. Those are scale models. They're drawn to scale or they're constructed to scale, but they're sort of tiny miniature versions. Full-scale simulation is like at the Lausanne University lab where the people come in and they arrange Legos and they build these actual full-scale apartment replicas or designs, or in our social ecology lab where we brought people into an actual office environment lab and varied the conditions they were working under to see how they affected their work. So that's more of a full-scale dynamic situation rather than a scale static situation. When you show somebody just a static model and ask them, do they think they would like living there or working there, that's a little bit of a different, that's more of a stretch for people because you have to imagine what would that look like, you know, if it were built out full scale. So scale models sort of make you, require that you make that leap. There's also photographic simulation where you show people pictures, and we talked about photo montage where you can change what's shown in the pictures so that you can gauge whether people like the earth tones or they like more vivid colors or they don't like high structures along the coastline. This is something they did in coastal planning in Oregon. So these are different types of simulation approaches, and we said that environmental simulation is part of the pre-design assessment. It's giving people previews of a future environment to gauge their reactions and avoid the kind of design mistakes that we've seen in Pruitt-Igoe, we've seen in Cabrini Green in Chicago, and you can think of other design mistakes where you have a dorm or a classroom that just doesn't work very well for the students. So we're trying to avoid those investments in environments that just have to be torn apart and bulldozed anyway, right? So it's a waste of a lot of resource. So that's one of the reasons we have this emphasis on environmental evaluation and environmental attitudes. All right, so I want to switch now into the material for today, which is human spatial behavior. And we've been talking about how people respond to environments, their reactions to environments, the reactive mode, if you will, of people dealing with their environment. And you know, people that are in dysfunctional environments and they can't do anything about it, they're kind of stuck in a reactive mode. They don't really have a lot of opportunity to be active and change the environment to their liking. Well, we're going into more of some research areas now that emphasize people's active use of space, for example. Like when you're in a social interaction or you're setting up your dorm room, how do you structure that space in a way that's more optimal for you? So you're taking kind of an active role in reducing stress if somebody's standing too close to you or setting up a territory that works more effectively for you. So here we've covered this active cognitive mode where people are interpreting their environment, environmental cognition, cognitive mapping, and how personality affects how people interpret their environment in an active way. But we also said that personality can be influenced by the environment in a reactive way. So one of the things I want to say about this diagram is it's a useful device to kind of locate different areas of research in the field. But the fact is we're all kind of cycling between these active and reactive modes. Ideally, we're kind of in an environment, we're interpreting it, we're evaluating it at the same time, we're behaving in it. As long as we have that kind of good reciprocal interactive relation with our surroundings, we're doing all those things together. And it's in the service of optimizing the fit or improving congruence that we use our interpretation and our actions and our evaluations to sort of bring the environment closer to what we want. Ideally, that's what we're trying to do. So today we're kind of moving up here the active behavioral way of dealing with environment. And next time we're going to talk about how do you get people to behave in an ecologically positive manner to protect their environment, to go green, for example. Today we're going to talk about proxemics, which is human spatial behavior, the use of space in everyday interaction. And as you read the Edward Hall chapters from his book, there's some very interesting examples of how these spatial zones and traditions or strategies vary from one culture to the next. And a lot of times you can get misunderstandings between people from different cultures because they're sort of working from very different expectations about space. So some of this research begins back with studies of animal populations living in very crowded, dense environments. And this was an early famous study of a herd of deer living in a winter climate on an island off of the coast of Maryland. And what they observed was a die-off of sort of the majority of animals in that herd died. And they kind of wanted to know what was going on there. Was it crowding? Was it the harsh temperatures? And one of the things about crowding is that it affects us depending on other things in the situation. So if we're dealing with a situation of crowding where we want more intimacy or we want more solitude, that crowding is going to affect us more adversely than if we want to go to a party or we want to go to an athletic event where we want more people to be present. So here they've got a kind of convergence of harsh temperature, density on that island, and it led to a die-off. And the authors of that study claimed that part of that was due to crowding stress, the animals being too close together. And they, in line with Wynne Edwards' study that we read about territorial spreading out of an animal population when it gets too dense to avoid a crash and an overconsumption of food resources. It was kind of in that vein. This is another study kind of in that sort of tradition by John Calhoun at NIH where he did this study of rats. We've mentioned this before. They called it the behavioral sink. There were areas in that experimental community where a lot of bad stuff happened, especially around the feeding areas and then some of those ramps going from one compartment to the next. The animals would attack each other. The subordinate animals would be attacked by the more dominant animals. The animals trying to get food, if they weren't dominant, would be pushed out of the way or attacked. And Wynne Edwards and Calhoun interpreted this as being part of the internal checks on population that, remember, their food was optimized. They had all the food they wanted. The temperature was optimal. Predators were not there. They tried to control microbes, biological, infections. But still, as an animal population starts to exceed its boundaries, these impulses toward territoriality spreading out and the dominance hierarchy kick in, and they become much more observable. So these are some of the things that were observed in crowding among non-human species. And also in the 60s, this book, The Population Bomb by Dr. Paul Ehrlich was published, and it was basically decrying the population explosion in the world and the fact that density was going to be our ruin. This was a book by Jonathan Friedman at Columbia University in the early 70s, which argued that density really is neutral. It doesn't affect people positively or negatively, but rather if somebody's living in a slum area and they're under hardship, density is not going to affect them very well. This paper that I did as a graduate student distinguished between density, a physical condition of space or lack of space, and crowding a motivational state where people feel stressed because they don't have enough space for whatever they want to get done. So density effects are determined by sort of the personal and situational factors and what people are trying to accomplish in a given situation. So these are some of the distinctions between density and crowding. Density is a physical kind of concept, an amount of space, and you can either talk about social density, which is the number of people per a given unit of space, or you can take the same number of people and vary their square footage, and that's called spatial density. So there's social density and spatial density. But all of these variants of density are basically measures of physical space, right? Crowding, on the other hand, is a psychological experience, and it refers to kind of a discomfort that arises from the perception that you don't have enough space for what you want to do. So this situation here, obviously, you've got pretty high density, but if that's chronic and people are that huddled together for a long enough period of time, they're going to start feeling crowding stress because they can't get away from that situation. And this is a model that, and I don't want you to try to memorize all the details of these boxes, but basically there are features of the environment, the way the physical environment is arranged, social status and social conditions in that situation, and together with individuals' personal attributes, like whether someone's a stimulation seeker or they are introverted or extroverted or something like that, it's that combination of the dense environment or some kind of social strain combined with a personal attribute that makes people more sensitive to crowding stress that you begin to get that stress experience. And the stress experience can manifest itself in terms of psychological symptoms, like the belief, the feeling that you don't have enough space, or a kind of emotional imbalance, feeling infringed on or peripheral to what's going on in the situation. You can also get physiological stress, and this is something that Hans Selye talked about in his book, The Stress of Life, in terms of the reaction of the thymus gland, the enlargement of the adrenals, the stomach ulcers. Those are symptoms of physiological stress. And then people respond to that crowding stress behaviorally, perceptually, by trying to work back and change the environment or change themselves. And by changing themselves, they might try to withdraw from that environment. They might try to get to know and like people in that situation a little better than before. So they're trying to modify, themselves personally, right? So these are different kind of adaptations that people can employ to try to reduce the feeling of crowding stress. So people's susceptibility to crowding depends on their personal attributes, a lot of social things going on in the situation, culture, and the physical environment. So here again, we're seeing that whole notion of systems, equilibrium, the kind of combination of environment and person features that determine whether someone is going to feel that fit or they're going to feel stressed in that setting. Now, where would you want high density? Where would that be desirable? Well, obviously, if you're in a situation where more people makes it a more exciting or interesting setting, you want greater density. You want that at a party, you want that at a sports event or a concert. If you go to a concert in Coachella and nobody's there, it's like not really worth going to. You want it to be an event, something you remember as, everybody showed up. So density is not always an undesirable thing. By the same token, there are a lot of situations where you absolutely do not want high density. You want more privacy, you want more separation from people. Whether you're trying to study quietly in a library or get some privacy with somebody that you're close with, romantically involved, these kinds of situations, you start to feel that crowding stress a lot sooner, right? So here's an example of what we mean by that equilibrium model of crowding stress. Somebody's tolerance for density or just one other person being in that situation is going to be a lot lower in these situations than the ones I showed you before because of the nature of the situation and what they're doing there. So obviously, high density is not a good or a bad thing in itself. Now, we've been talking about crowding where people don't have enough sort of separation between themselves and other people. And you can also have a situation of isolation where you feel like you don't have enough contact with other people. You want more contact. You're undercrowded. So how do people kind of maintain this balance between crowding stress on the one hand and feeling isolated on the other. So there are behavioral mechanisms, according to Robert Summer, that people use to optimize their contact with other people. So what do we mean by personal space? Well, we said that it's an area around somebody's body, it's an invisible kind of zone, and if people go into it too closely, you start to feel uncomfortable. You start to feel that stress of too much proximity. So personal space is one of the mechanisms that we use to adjust our space in our everyday interactions and either clam up and not be as open with people, or to approach them and reduce our personal space needs so that we can have more contact depending on the situation. According to Edward Hall, who's an anthropologist, he found some very sort of consistent zones of personal space in his research across many different cultures. So one zone is the intimate zone, 0 to 18 inches of contact with somebody else. The personal distance zone of 1.5 to 4 feet out. Social distance, 4 to 12 feet out. Or public distance, where you go into a lecture and you're interacting with the speaker who's up on a podium and you're separated from that person. So these are different sort of zones of personal space that people use, and these go across a lot of different cultures. Generally, the need for personal space seems to be a culturally universal thing, but how it's managed is quite different. You know, some cultures use clothing, veils to sort of reduce the contact that somebody has visually with other people. Some people use behavioral mannerisms to cut down contact with other people. So we're going to take a look at some of that. So it's culturally variable, for sure. There are cities and there are cultures that are close personal space. And generally what Hall found is that in the Middle East, in Latin America, in Asia, you find, and in some European areas, you find closer personal space norms. People are used to kind of getting in close with each other. They like a lot of sort of high contact interaction, even with strangers. They're not put off by that. And yet there are other cultures where you have much larger personal space needs. And these would be Northern Europe, Canada, and these are, you know, gross generalizations, obviously, but as Hall interviewed people across many different cultures, these are some of the patterns that he found, that there was a cultural variation in people's use and need for personal space. Now this is a bit of a busy slide, which you can, territorial behavior, which we're going to talk about. We've talked about it with Wynne Edwards, but we're going to talk about it as it applies to humans, not just non-human species. These concepts or these processes work together to optimize people's control over their privacy. So in an ideal situation where you have an environment that you can modify, you want to maintain, you want to hit that sweet spot of just the amount of privacy or lack of privacy you want with other people in that situation. If you don't have control over the situation, people can come in and infringe on you and do whatever they want, and you have no control over it. So privacy is the central concept, and it sort of binds the other processes together. It's a regulatory process where a person or group makes themselves more or less accessible or open to others. And then personal space and territoriality are mechanisms that help that person achieve their desired level of privacy. So if you want more privacy, you step away, you increase your personal space, or you set up a territory in your room where you say, you put on your door, you know, please don't disturb me now, or visitors are not welcome. So you set up territorial devices to push people away. Crowding is a social condition where privacy mechanisms have not functioned effectively, so you have an excess of undesired social contact. And privacy-related behaviors, all these behaviors are working as a dynamic system. So remember we said that, you know, people-environment relationships are part of systems. That's why we went over systems theory. And they strive to maintain a kind of equilibrium or fit between the person and their environment. So that's what this model says. And in this slide, it's kind of a diagrammatic portrayal of what Altman is saying. He's saying that you start with some ideal level of privacy given somebody that you're interacting with in a situation. They may be a stranger, they may be somebody you don't like, they may be somebody you really like a lot, you want to get to know better. And based on that ideal, you adjust your personal space, your territorial behavior, your verbal behavior, what you say to somebody, or your nonverbal behavior, how you glare at them or you smile at them. And these are that differentiated set of system behaviors. Remember, we said systems get differentiated. So you can hit the ideal level of privacy, or you can achieve your privacy ideal by varying these different behaviors. And that's what we mean by differentiation in systems. And if you don't do that effectively, you might get isolated. So here you've got more privacy than what you wanted. Or you could get crowded where you have less privacy than what you wanted. So these things play out and they determine what your actual achieved level of privacy is. And the optimum would be, where you're achieving the level of privacy you want. So this is basically an equilibrium model, sort of tying together these different concepts of personal space, territory, crowding, isolation, and privacy. So social isolation, you have too much privacy relative to what you want. That's a kind of stress. Remember, we said stress is an imbalance between environmental demands and your ability to cope with that environment. Crowding is a different kind of stress where you have less privacy than what you want. So those are basic differences in that model of those two concepts. Now, territoriality, and we're going to talk about differences between human and non-human territoriality, because they're quite different. In the Wynne Edwards article, territoriality was all about feeding and breeding. Those were the main biological functions as to why animals claim and defend territory. In humans, it gets a lot more nuanced. We have copyrights, we have patents, we have our cars that become our territory. We have multiple residences, our room back at home and our dorm room. So human territoriality gets a little bit more complex. So Altman defines this as a self-other boundary regulation mechanism that involves personalizing or marking a place or object and communicating that it's owned by you, by a person or group. So you're marking something to communicate your identity, that you own that space. And we saw examples of that in the corporate conference room. We also saw examples of it in a dorm room where people put up items of interest on their wall to sort of reflect who they are. This is done to regulate social interaction and to satisfy social as well as physical needs. So a social need might be you want to express your political leanings, so you put up posters in your dorm room for Obama or for Romney or whoever you're supporting to kind of communicate to people that that's what you're about socially. And then defense responses sometimes occur when people invade your territory. Okay, so territory can be set up, but it doesn't always hold people back from infringing or violating it. So we're going to show a couple of videos here that convey what we mean by territoriality. And I think as you see these, maybe you can relate to them in things that have happened.
Boy, I'm really surprised at Elaine. That whole phone business, she should know better than that.
Hey!
What?
Where do you think this relationship is? If you are thinking of instituting an open-door urination policy, let me disabuse you of that notion right now, my friend.
You're so uptight.
Yeah, uptight. Let's all just have a big pee party. Hey, everybody, grab a bucket. We're going up to Jerry's. It's a pee party.
We said that territoriality began to be studied in animal populations, and there was a lot of interest in how animals mark their territory for feeding and breeding purposes. The next example is from sort of a human example.
When you enter the restroom, always select the urinal that is as far away as possible from men who are using other urinals. Here are some illustrations of various urinal situations and the proper course of action for each. Situation number 1. All urinals are empty. Correct action. Take the urinal on either edge. This allows others to most effectively comply with the rules that are to follow. Situation number 2. One urinal is taken. Correct action. The urinal on the right is the optimum choice here. This minimizes the chance of any contact whatsoever with the other man in the bathroom. Situation number 3. Two urinals are taken. Correct action. the middle urinal, which is equidistant from the other two occupants. Situation number 4. 3 urinals are taken. Correct action: no urinal is acceptable. The loo has now reached critical mass. Leave and come back later, or use a stall. Under no circumstances should 2 adjacent urinals be in use at the same
So
time.
that may be a little over the top example, but I think the fact is that people do have territorial needs and behaviors, not just related to bathrooms, but how they set up their rooms. And people are quite sensitive to territorial infringement. So it becomes important to kind of understand, how is this accomplished, how is it carried out in various situations, and to what extent does it prevent stress, or does it sort of improve people's experience of their environments? So what constitutes an effective territory, so to speak? And as far as the restroom research goes, actually there's been a lot of work on restroom behavior and, as I mentioned, parity between women and men's restrooms because of the longer queues and waiting times that women experience in public restrooms. And there's been testimony in Congress by environmental psychologists about this, so it's not something that actually hasn't been studied, so that's why I went ahead and threw it up there. All right. As you read Edward Hall in his chapters in The Hidden Dimension, he talks about cultural use of space, cultural differences in territory. But in addition to those spatial behaviors, there are what he calls semi-fixed and fixed features of spaces that people use to adjust their territory. So a fixed feature would be an attribute of a setting that cannot be readily modified by occupants. So the way these front doors are designed together, that's fixed. Nobody's going to change that around. A semi-fixed feature attribute of a setting is where people can arrange their furniture, they can decorate their walls, they can do things to that physical environment that gives them at least some flexibility or customizability in terms of how they're going to use that space. So Hall is saying that we kind of are stuck with, or we have to conform to and adapt to what the fixed features are. You know, if our window of our bedroom is out over a very busy highway, there's not a whole lot we can do about that in terms of changing the design of that environment. So semi-fixed, though, you can actually modify and adjust pretty readily. Now, there are different types of territories. Erwin Altman talks about primary, secondary, and public territories. A primary territory is one where you spend a lot of time, you have a lot of your personal psychological needs wrapped up in that space, and it's primary to your identity, to what you want to get done. You know, when you go into your room or your office, you want to be able to get your work done and not get interrupted, or you want to have privacy with a friend. That's a pretty important space to you. Secondary spaces are a little more public, and they're group spaces. So groups set up a territory temporarily where they want to have a conversation, or they put their books down in the library to mark a place where they're going to meet. A public territory is not really owned or under jurisdiction of any particular individuals or groups. It's just a completely open space. So a beach, if you go to, Corona del Mar Beach, basically it's not a behavior setting that's owned or populated by particular people doing a particular behavioral program. It's an open public setting or territory where you can set up your blanket anywhere you want, and there's no sort of jurisdiction there. And one of the things you're seeing in the class, I think, is that we're using examples with different terms. So you can talk about an interior identity cue or self-directed identity cue, but in Gosling's paper, but you can also talk about it as a physical trace. Somebody can go in, look at that room, and have a kind of cue as to what you're interested in. So it's a physical trace. So we talked about that in environmental assessment. We've also talked about behavior settings. So this is a kind of temporary behavior setting. This is a more permanent anchored behavior setting in a particular building or space. This would be a public space that isn't really a behavior setting the way Barker defined it. So it's more of a public territory. Yeah, say your name. Amanda.
What about when public spaces kind of get owned by different groups? Like if a gang takes over a space, a neighborhood, or Or you just don't feel like it's a beach for everybody? Like you feel like it's gotten taken over by the teenagers or something, and you don't feel comfortable because you're in a different age group or something?
Yeah, no, that's a very common kind of thing where a particular group appropriates a public space and makes it their secondary or even primary territory. And one of the reasons that the Fun Center off of the 405 freeway and Michelson got built for sort of some of the younger age people in Irvine is that for a while, a lot of the teenage groups were sort of going into the parking lot of Wholesome Choice or some of the other shopping centers and sort of taking it over as their hangout, their meeting space. And so a lot of people felt that there was a need for behavior settings that catered to people of younger age, just as there's a need for senior centers in Irvine. So there was an effort to try to diversify those settings and put some investment in, the bowling alleys over there and the recreation zone. Yeah, but a lot of times these kind of spaces, a public, walkway or sidewalk can be taken over, and you can see indications of that through graffiti, through gang markings and the like. So territories typically get marked, they get personalized in some way. So a few more slides talking about territoriality at the human and non-human level. So some of the differences between human territoriality is that they tend to be larger scale than animal territories and more complex. So we can have multiple territories, like I mentioned, between cars and multiple residences. We can have a national territory. We can have a home territory where, our dorm or our home environment where we grew up. We can belong to a lot of different groups. So, that's quite different than in most animal populations where you're in a single residential group in a particular area. With humans, there's much more emphasis on social motives for creating territories. So protecting your ideas through a patent or a copyright, for example. It's not all about feeding and breeding as it is in animal populations. We can have multiple locations for our territories. Territories can be other people, objects, ideas, and sometimes people relate to others as if they're their territory or their object. We can talk about variability and complexity in response to territorial invasion. So in animal populations, you'll have a kind of defense or aggressive response to try to keep out an invader. In a human situation, you might have a verbal response saying, I don't really want to talk to you right now. Please, I'm not open for business here, or I don't want you to come in my room right now. I want to take a rest. So you can, put people back verbally or non-verbally. So that's quite different than in animal populations. How are these two concepts different? We've talked about how they're interrelated with crowding and isolation and privacy. They're different in the sense that personal space is more portable and invisible. It's a zone around you that you carry around with you. Whereas territory is more stationary, it's visible, it's your car, it's your room, it's a place typically. This is person-centered, it's your personal space, whereas territory is place-centered. It belongs or relates to a particular place that you've marked in some way and that you own. And groups can have territory as well. Groups don't have personal space so much as they might have a secondary territory, but groups certainly mark places, and that's where you have the decorated conference room, for example, being a group environment, a group setting. And then invasion, when you have invasion of personal space, often there's a withdrawal response, whereas for territorial defense, you have more of a defense response, digging in, drawing a line in the sand, and not letting people take over or infringe on that territory. So territory gives you an advantage, and when animals can lay claim to territory and defend it and hold it, it gives them a distinct advantage over predators, over other members of the species, because people in their home base are usually much more effective. When you look at the home and visiting records of different teams, you can see that teams, when they're playing on their home field, are a lot more successful in terms of the win-loss record, okay? So these are some differences between personal space and territoriality. We've talked about differences between human and non-human territory. And just by way of summary, and these are actually covered in the chapter that I assigned during the second week of the class, or maybe it was class session 2, on the environmental context of behavior and well-being. that chapter reviews some of these research findings. Evidence for individual differences in personal space, strong cultural differences, friendship and physical attractiveness obviously play a big role in people's personal space needs in any given situation. In informal settings, people's personal space needs shrink down. They're not as demanding as in a formal setting. And also this role of cubic space as well as rectilinear space. So when you raise the ceilings, even though you're keeping the square footage the same, people's sense of crowding and spatial closeness goes down. And there's some recent research that raising the ceiling height actually changes people's cognition. When you have groups trying to do different tasks and be creative, people tend to be sort of more out of the box in their thinking when they have more cubic space. Not sure why that is. And when they confine groups, the researchers confine groups to tighter spaces, they seem to be more detail-oriented and sort of better on the details, but not as good on the creative tasks. So that's kind of an interesting recent update of some of the work on cubic and rectilinear space. And finally, with territoriality, some of the findings that stand out is markers are pretty effective. When you put a book bag down at the library, people tend to respect that. They don't infringe on it. So territorial markers often are pretty effective in holding that space. Not always. I mean, if you go to a concert and the chairs are filling up quickly, you're not necessarily going to hold your space by putting a program on it, but or in a movie theater. But in other cases, they do work to sort of hold the territory. The more personal the marker, the greater the protective value. So if you put a jacket or a coat down there at a table, that has a little more suasion than if you just put a pencil or a pen or something like that. The longer the occupancy, the more elaborate the marker system. So as people reside in a particular territory longer, they get more differentiated and more nuanced in how they mark that space and keep it their own. And finally, territorial markers of residential settings can reduce vulnerability to burglary. And we're going to see later in the course from a study done in Utah that when a walkthrough of neighborhoods was done and different physical features of homes were recorded, like whether they had fences or hedges around them, whether they had personalized nameplates on the door, there were a number of features that were associated with lower burglary rates. And also when they showed pictures of these different homes in Salt Lake City to people that had been convicted of burglary, those former burglars were very good at sort of picking out which homes they would hit, which homes they'd avoid, because of certain cues that conveyed greater territorial defense. So these territorial cues play out, and they can be pretty influential for a lot of different behaviors. All right, Mark's going to show a couple of videos now. One of my sons is a TV reporter, and we've been talking about environmental assessment, and he always used to say, I don't want to become a professor, I don't want to be an academic, I want to be, out there on a baseball field or, doing Tom Brokaw in the TV studio. Anyway, he got called on by one of his stations when he took his first job in Louisiana to do an environmental assessment project. So the news director said, you've got to go out and you've got to look at the quality of our streets and cover the crews doing pothole repair. And my son said, that's one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. I don't want to do that. And so he decided to try to make some fun out of it and enjoy it. And what was supposed to be a 1-month thing for sweeps, these stations do different packages for sweeps to try to increase their ratings, turned out to be a 1.5 years because the community kept wanting pothole patrol. So for some fun, we show some of those episodes. So you can run one of those.
Seatbelt after you see our next report. Potholes. They are seemingly everywhere. They're annoying and they're dangerous.
News 12's Eli Sokol joins us now live from just north of downtown Shreveport with this special report. Eli, have you found some?
Michelle, we found some. We're at Finn and Riku, a small intersection here just off of North Market Street. And this is about as bad as it gets, but there are a lot of streets across town that have these kind of bumps, cracks, and potholes, and streets that if your car has anything to say about it are best avoided. Now this kind of damage can happen in one rainy night, it can happen in one sweltering afternoon, usually a lot faster than the crews can get out to patch them. This is an ongoing and never-ending war on potholes, and that's why News 12 is on the Pothole Patrol. You've been there, driving along, perhaps with a ringtail lemur, enjoying the view from the dash, when suddenly, what was that? Bet they don't have potholes like that in Madagascar. In this asphalt jungle, they're everywhere.
Potholes aren't going away, are they?
Potholes will never go away as long as you have asphalt.
Almost as fast as they can surface, Ernie Negretti's crew is on the scene to resurface. Cutting, spraying, pouring, filling, and tamping.
We try to get to them as soon as possible. If they're called in, we try to get there as quick as we can.
Because you know that if you don't get to them,
we're going to have claims filed saying that damages to cars.
And possibly worse, right?
Right.
Possibly.
Accidents, trying to swerve around and miss them.
And if you don't miss them, you'll likely end up here.
Hitting the potholes all the time on the streets just take its toll on it eventually.
On this truck, the idle-longs are loose.
They get a lot of slack in it. It throws the alignment out, which starts causing the tire wear.
Mechanic James Hill knows a little pothole can cause a domino effect of damage.
Tie rod ends, center lengths, sway bar bushings, ball joints, coil springs.
That noise you hear, that's your pocketbook getting lighter. Compared to that, a little early morning jackhammering never sounded so good. For quite some time.
Driving over these same holes for 12 years.
There are no doubt hundreds of potholes that people would like to have patched all across the Arklatex. In fact, this one I'm standing in right now, pointed out, brought to our attention by a News 12 viewer named Bob Pasillo. Bob works right across the street, and Bob just tired of driving over this thing day after day.
Leela, what kind of response have you received about the local pothole problems?
Well, Carl, funny you should ask. I've got in my hands here a stack of emails that we've gotten from viewers, emails, phone messages, and this is just the beginning, listing the various locations where there are potholes that people are tired of driving over and would like to see fixed. Now, we're going to hand these over to the city officials, let them take care of it, but we'll be looking into this as well as we continue this series on potholes. And you got a pothole you'd like to see patched? Well, give us a call at the station, the phone number 222-1212, or log on to our website, ksla.com, and click on the Pothole Patrol. Together, we can help make the streets a bit smoother and a whole lot safer.
Eli Stokel's on Pothole Patrol in the Arklatex. Thank you for that report, Eli.
Judging by the number of viewer calls and emails, there are more than just a few streets out there that need more than just a little smoothing out.
It's a big job, but Eli Stokel's and the Pothole Patrol seem to have it all together now. Eli, we understand you guys have been very busy today.
Oh, you're right, Michelle. We've been all over the city, following up on viewers' tips, trying to track down all the potholes we can, potholes big and small, and there are a lot of them, and trying to get them patched as quickly as we can. Now, the last time we were in this intersection, this is Finn and Riku, just off of North Market Street, north of Shreveport, full of crater-sized holes. Well, as you can see, the city got out here early this morning, pretty smooth now. Here and all across the city and the Arklatex, the Pothole Patrol is just getting warmed up. This rocky road has roughed up its last car. It took a 7-man crew and a little push from the Pothole Patrol to repair what's known as a base failure, a sort of pothole gone mad.
Just completely torn up, and what we did now, we're going to come in and take out the bad surface, resurface it back, put in dry material, and then put the hot mix back on and compact it back down.
Well, that could take a while, so we found and followed another pothole patcher, following up on your tips. Viewers are keeping you guys pretty busy, huh?
Yes, sir, they are. And I tell you, I just love doing what I'm doing, and I was just trying to please the public.
Get these things patched as quick as possible, huh?
Yes, sir.
This stretch of Kings Highway, too tough for a 2-man crew. So we're off to the next one, following perhaps a bit too close behind. Hold on to your hat, lemur. Here we go. Hey, Henry, let's fix this one before someone gets hurt.
This area's kind of sunk down to the ground, and we're going to level it up real nice and neat so the cars can make a smooth transition across it.
Our viewers love the smell of asphalt.
No pothole control!
first I thought you were just talking, but I see that you all are for real about what you're talking about doing.
Oh, as real as that sweet sound of the tamper. It's music to our ears. And you just might hear it rolling down your street sometime soon. Now, this street would be fully paved if the city hadn't run out of hot mix. That's the asphalt this morning. They've been pretty busy, and they know they're going to need to get a lot more of that if they want to keep up with our viewers and the pothole patrol.
And Eli, the pothole patrol is for real. Like the ladies were saying, you're for real, pothole patrol.
Yes, we are.
Tell me this, when does the city hope to have that area fully repaired?
Well, this street right here, they say they'll have more of that hot mix. They'll be able to get this paved by Monday. Now, obviously, though, there are a lot more potholes and base failures and other things out across the Arklatex, and we want to hear about them, so give us a call at the station. It's 222-1212, that's the number, or you can go online to our website, ksla.com, and click on the Pothole Patrol. We'll see how many more of these things we can get patched up by our next report, which is coming up next Wednesday on News 12 at 6.
All right, good job to you and, of course, the city workers. Thank you, Eli.
All right, so probably was a slow news day that day, but they wound up having to do these for the next year and a half, actually. And so for a guy that thought he would never be doing environmental assessment research or anything like that, he was kind of pressed into service. So I just tried to make some fun out of it. Anyway, have a good day, and we'll see you next Tuesday.